Alright, so we've been talking about how these different show universes interact, and now we're going to figure out which Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul characters could actually survive if they got dropped into the Sopranos world. Because the thing is, these are very different environments. Breaking Bad is mostly about the drug trade in the Southwest, dealing with cartels and independent operators. The Sopranos is old school East Coast organized crime with hierarchies and traditions going back generations. The rules are different, the culture is different, the consequences are different. So who makes it and who gets whacked immediately? Let's do this. Walter White, yes, he survives. Walt could survive in the Sopranos world, but his experience would be completely different than what we see in Breaking Bad. First off, Walt's got a skill that's valuable anywhere there's a drug trade. He's an elite chemist who can produce extremely pure product. That skill translates across any criminal organization. Whether it's the Albuquerque meth scene or the New Jersey mob, quality product is quality product. But Walt would have to completely change his approach. In Breaking Bad, Walt builds his own empire and eventually becomes the boss. That's not happening in the Sopranos world. The mob has established hierarchies that have existed for decades. You don't just show up and start taking over territory. Walt would have to come in as an asset, not as a player. He'd be like the guy who runs a specific operation for the family. He'd make his money, he'd have some protection, but he wouldn't have power or respect in the way he does in Breaking Bad. And honestly, that might keep Walt alive longer because it would limit his ego's ability to get him in trouble. In Breaking Bad, Walt's ego is what causes most of his problems. He can't just be successful, he has to be recognized as the best. In the mob, that attitude gets you killed. If Walt understood his role and stuck to it, he could have a decent career. The mob would value his chemistry skills and protect him as long as he kept producing and didn't cause problems. Walt would make good money, probably better than as a high school teacher, and he'd be relatively safe as long as he didn't overstep. The question is whether Walt's ego would allow him to accept that limited role. Based on what we know about Walt, probably not. He'd eventually try to maneuver for more power or respect, and that's when the mob would have a problem with him. But purely from a survival standpoint, if Walt kept his head down and just did the chemistry, yeah, he could survive in the Sopranos world. Jesse Pinkman, maybe, but he'd be miserable. Jesse might survive, but his life would be absolutely terrible. Jesse's a street-level dealer when we meet him in Breaking Bad. He knows how to cook, he knows how to sell, he's got connections in the drug scene. That's transferable to any city's drug trade. If Jesse ended up working for someone in the New Jersey mob, he'd probably be doing the same kind of work he did early in Breaking Bad. Moving product, dealing with addicts, handling the dirty ground level stuff that the made guys don't want to touch directly. But Jesse's personality would make this life even worse for him than it already is in Breaking Bad. Jesse's got a conscience that constantly torments him. He feels guilty about hurting people, about getting people addicted, about the violence of the drug trade. The mob culture would grind Jesse down even more than the Breaking Bad world does. At least in Breaking Bad, Jesse occasionally works with people like Mike who treat him with some respect. In the mob, Jesse would just be some junky street dealer that nobody respects or cares about. Jesse's addiction issues would also be a constant problem. The mob doesn't have patience for unreliable people. If Jesse was using heavily and screwing up jobs, he'd get hurt or killed pretty quickly. The only reason I say maybe instead of definitely no is that Jesse's a survivor. He's got street smarts and he knows how to navigate dangerous situations. He might be able to find some crew that would keep him around as long as he kept making the money. But Jesse's quality of life would be horrible. He'd be using drugs to cope with the guilt and the violence. He'd be surrounded by people who view him as disposable. He wouldn't have anyone like Walt manipulating him, but also occasionally protecting him, or Mike looking out for him. He'd just be alone in a brutal world. So maybe Jesse survives physically, but emotionally and psychologically he'd be destroyed. Gus Fring thrives. Gus would not just survive in the Sopranos world, he'd probably thrive and eventually become a major player. Gus's whole skill set is perfect for the mob world. He's patient, he's strategic, he understands hierarchy and respect, he knows how to build legitimate business fronts, he can be ruthless when necessary, but doesn't cause unnecessary problems. If Gus started out in the New Jersey mob scene, he'd probably begin by running some legitimate businesses that could be used for money laundering. The chicken restaurant chain would work just as well in New Jersey as it does in New Mexico. Gus would make himself valuable to whichever family he connected with. He'd be the guy who handles the boring business side of things, who makes sure money gets laundered properly, who maintains the appearance of legitimacy. The mob would value that because those skills are actually pretty rare, and Gus would be strategic about building power. He wouldn't try to take over immediately like Walt would. Gus would spend years building relationships, proving his value, gaining trust. He'd position himself as indispensable before he ever tried to move against anyone. The The mob culture would actually suit Gus better than the cartel did. The mob has rules and traditions that Gus would respect and work within. He's not trying to break the system, he's trying to master it and rise within it. Eventually, Gus would probably become a captain or even higher. He's too smart, too competent, and too valuable to stay at a low level, and he'd do it in a way that wouldn't threaten the existing power structure until he was ready to make his move. The one risk for Gus is that his lack of Italian heritage might limit how high he can rise in a traditional mob family, but Gus would find ways around that. Maybe by becoming so valuable that the rules get bent for him, or by building his own crew that operates semi-independently. So yeah, Gus doesn't just survive, he thrives. The Sopranos world is actually better suited to Gus's skills and temperament than the Breaking Bad world. Mike Ehrmantraut, yes, he'd do fine. Mike would survive and probably have a comfortable career in the Sopranos world. Mike's skill set is exactly what the mob needs. He's a fixer, a cleaner, someone who handles problems discreetly and professionally. That's valuable in any criminal organization. Mike would probably end up in a role similar to what he has with Gus. He'd be the guy who gets called when there's a problem that needs handling. Bodies need disposing, witnesses need intimidating, jobs need planning and executing. Mike can do all of that. The mob would respect Mike because he's a professional. He doesn't cause drama, he doesn't ask unnecessary questions, he does the job efficiently and keeps his mouth shut. Those qualities are exactly what the mob values in a soldier. Mike would also fit well culturally. He's got that blue-collar Philadelphia working-class background. He was a cop who understood how both sides of the law work. That experience would translate well to working with the New Jersey mob, which has a lot of former or current law enforcement connections. Mike's only real vulnerability would be his attachment to his granddaughter. In Breaking Bad, that's what keeps him in the game long after he should get out. In the Sopranos world, that same attachment could be used against him if someone wanted leverage. But Mike's smart enough to keep his family life separate from his work. He'd make sure his granddaughter was far away from New Jersey and protected from any blowback from his criminal activities. Mike would probably have a long career, make decent money, and eventually retire to spend time with his granddaughter. He's not ambitious enough to threaten anyone, competent enough to be valuable, and professional enough to avoid causing problems. So yeah, Mike survives just fine. Saul Goodman lives as a shady backdoor guy. Saul would survive by being exactly what he is in Breaking Bad, maybe even more so. The mob needs lawyers who are willing to bend or break rules. They need people who can handle problems legally, who know judges and prosecutors, who can make evidence disappear or witnesses reconsider testifying. Saul's entire skill set is built for this. He's a criminal lawyer in both senses of the word. He defends criminals, but he's also willing to be criminal himself when necessary. That makes him valuable to organized crime. In The Sopranos, there are lawyers like this. Neil Mink is Tony's legitimate high-powered attorney, but there are also shadier lawyers who handle dirtier work. Saul would fit right into that second category. They'd use Saul would probably operate they wouldn't let him get dingy office to the actual family one of the other cities near where the mob operates. Someone he'd handle the cases that the respectable not someone who gets brought into he'd know all the dirty tricks and that's fine charges dropped. He'd make good money, he'd have protection from the mob as long as he was useful, and he'd stay alive by being necessary but not important enough to be a threat. Saul's personality would actually work well in this context. His sleazy charm and his willingness to do whatever it takes to get the job done would be appreciated. The mob doesn't need him to be respectable, they just need him to be effective. The only risk is if Saul got too greedy or tried to play different families against each other. But Saul's smart enough to know where the lines are, usually. He might push boundaries, but he'd probably avoid doing anything that would get him killed. So Saul survives as a useful tool for the mob, making decent money and staying out of serious trouble as long as he keeps his head down. Tuco Salamanca, dead very quickly. Tuco would be dead within weeks, maybe days of arriving in the Sopranos world. Tuco's completely unstable. He's violent, unpredictable, paranoid because of the meth he's using, and he doesn't respect any kind of authority or hierarchy. All of those qualities get you killed immediately in the mob. If Tuco somehow got involved with one of the New Jersey families, his first violent outburst would be his last. The mob doesn't tolerate the kind of crazy, unpredictable violence that Tuco brings. It's bad for business and it attracts law enforcement attention. Like, imagine Tuco in a sit-down with Tony and some of the other guys. Someone says something Tuco doesn't like, and Tuco starts screaming and threatening people. In Breaking Bad, Tuco can get away with that sometimes because he's protected by the cartel. In the Sopranos world, Tony would just have Tuco killed that day. Tuco also doesn't understand the concept of earning respect through the hierarchy. He thinks respect comes from fear and violence. That works in certain contexts, but not in an organization with rules and traditions. The mob would see Tuco as a rabid dog that needs to be put down before he bites someone important. He's too dangerous, too unstable, and too disrespectful to be allowed to live. Tuco might last a little longer if he stayed in the street-level drug trade and never interacted with the mob directly. But eventually, he'd cause enough problems that the mob would hear about him and decide to eliminate the problem. So no, Tuco doesn't survive. He gets whacked almost immediately. Lalo Salamanca survives. Lalo would survive and probably do pretty well for himself in the Sopranos world. Lalo's got everything you need to navigate the mob. He's smart, he's charming, he understands respect and hierarchy, he can be violent when necessary, but he's not needlessly aggressive. He reads people well and knows how to position himself. If Lalo ended up in New Jersey, he'd probably start by establishing himself in some specific area of business. Maybe he'd run some gambling operations or some restaurants that serve as fronts. He'd be friendly with everyone, make himself useful, and gradually build a reputation. The mob would initially be suspicious of Lalo because he's an outsider, but Lalo's charm offensive would eventually win people over. He'd show respect to the bosses, he'd make money for the family, he'd handle problems efficiently. Lalo's biggest asset is his intelligence combined with his ability to seem non-threatening. He's actually extremely dangerous, but he comes across as this friendly, easygoing guy. That would allow him to move through the mob world without triggering defensive reactions from people in power. Lalo would also be smart enough not to overstep. He'd understand that there are rules and traditions he needs to follow. He wouldn't try to take over or challenge the existing hierarchy. He'd just carve out his own profitable territory and maintain good relationships with everyone. The only scenario where Lalo gets in trouble is if he gets caught up in some war between families or if someone discovers he's more dangerous than he appears. But Lalo's good at managing those risks. So yeah, Lalo survives and probably prospers. He's got the skills and temperament to succeed in the mob world. Nacho Varga survives initially but then gets whacked. Nacho's story in the Sopranos world would probably be similar to his story in Better Call Saul, just with different players. Nacho's competent, loyal, and good at his job. If he started working for one of the mob crews, he'd probably become a reliable soldier. He'd handle whatever tasks he was given, make money for his captain, and generally be a valued member of the organization. But Nacho's weakness is his father. Everything Nacho does is motivated by protecting his dad, and in the mob world, that kind of obvious vulnerability is dangerous. What would probably happen is Nacho would get caught between competing interests, just like he does in Better Call Saul. Maybe he's working for one captain, but another captain or another family tries to flip him. Or maybe his boss wants to use his father's business for something illegal, and Nacho has to choose between his loyalty to the family and protecting his dad. Eventually, Nacho would be forced to make a move to protect his father that would be seen as betrayal by the mob, and once you're marked as a traitor in the mob, you're dead. Nacho might survive for a few years, maybe even longer if he's lucky and smart about protecting his father. But ultimately, his love for his dad would put him in an impossible situation where he'd have to betray the family to protect his father, and that betrayal would get him killed. It's tragic because Nacho's actually a good soldier. He's capable, reliable, and smart, but his vulnerability is too obvious and eventually someone would exploit it in a way that forces Nacho to choose between the family and his father. So Nacho survives initially and might even do well for a while, but he eventually gets whacked when his loyalty to his father conflicts with his loyalty to the mob. Hank Schrader won't survive. Hank would not survive in the Sopranos world, and it's kind of sad because Hank's a good cop who's just in over his head. The problem is the New Jersey mob has way more experience dealing with law enforcement than the people Hank usually goes after. Tony and his crew have been managing relationships with cops, prosecutors, and FBI agents for decades. They know how to protect themselves. If Hank started investigating the mob the way he investigates Heisenberg, he'd run into walls immediately. His warrants would get blocked by judges on the mob's payroll. His witnesses would refuse to testify or recant their statements. His evidence would mysteriously disappear or become inadmissible. And if Hank started getting too close to actually building a case, the mob would just kill him. They wouldn't hesitate the way the cartel does in Breaking Bad. The mob has killed cops before and they do it again if necessary to protect the family. Hank's also got this cowboy mentality where he trusts his instincts and sometimes bends rules to get results. That works okay in the DA going after drug dealers. But against the mob with all their legal protections and political connections, Hank's tactics would just get him in trouble. The mob would also exploit Hank's relationships. They'd pressure him through his wife Marie or through other family connections. The mob's really good at finding pressure points and using them. Hank might realize what he's up against and back off. If he's smart, he'd recognize that the mob is too entrenched and too well protected to take down with the resources he has. But based on what we know about Hank, he'd probably push forward anyway because of his pride and his sense of duty. And that would get him killed. The mob would set up some situation where Hank gets shot. Maybe make it look like a robbery or a traffic incident. And that would be the end of Hank's investigation and Hank's life. So no, Hank doesn't survive. He's a good cop, but he's not equipped to handle the level of corruption and violence he'd face going after the mob. The overall picture. Looking at all these characters, the ones who survive in the Sopranos world are the ones who understand hierarchy, respect, and knowing your place. Gus thrives because he's a master at working within systems. Mike does fine because he's a professional who doesn't cause problems. Lalo survives because he's smart enough to play the game. Even Walt could survive if he accepts a limited role. But the characters who can't survive are either too unstable like Tuco, too honest like Hank, or too vulnerable like Nacho eventually becomes. The Sopranos world is more structured and traditional than the Breaking Bad world. There are rules that have existed for generations, and breaking those rules has immediate and fatal consequences. Characters who can adapt to that structure survive. Characters who can't or won't adapt get killed. What's interesting is that some characters would actually do better in the Sopranos world than in Breaking Bad. Gus would probably be happier and more successful in a traditional mob structure than dealing with the unpredictable cartel. Mike would appreciate working for an organization with clearer rules and hierarchy, but characters like Jesse, who are barely surviving in Breaking Bad, would be even worse off in the more brutal and unforgiving mob culture. Let me know in the comments if you think I got any of these wrong, or if there are other Breaking Bad characters I should have included. These crossover hypotheticals are always fun to think about because it shows how much the environment shapes who survives and who doesn't.